In a remote corner of the vast universe, where stars flicker like distant diamonds and planets follow their own peculiar orbits, resides a colossal being so immense that even the tallest earthly mountains would barely graze its knees. This being is known as Micromegas, hailing from Sirius, a realm where the dimensions of life and wisdom far exceed human comprehension. Accompanied by a diminutive yet equally remarkable companion from Saturn, these two cosmic explorers set out on an extraordinary mission to investigate the small, often overlooked planet called Earth. What awaits these giants from distant worlds is a mystery far greater than their own massive forms, a truth that transcends mere physicality. On this tiny blue globe, they will encounter minute beings who, despite their fragility, perceive themselves as the epicenter of the universe, entangled in wars, philosophies, and intricate systems that defy reason. Micromegas is far more than a tale of science fiction. It serves as a daring commentary on the human condition, infused with the sharp wit and biting irony of Voltaire. In this fantastical journey, the celestial giants plunge into the minuscule realm of humanity, probing its beliefs, follies, and, above all, its hubris. What appears to be a simple cosmic adventure evolves into a compelling parable about the insignificance of our existence in the face of vast knowledge. Through the eyes of these interstellar voyagers, Voltaire beckons us to embark on a journey that challenges us to reconsider our place in the cosmos. Can we look beyond our limited perspectives, or will we once again be ensnared by the vanities that bind us? Let us turn the pages of this text and witness the astonishing events that unfold when two titans from the stars touch down on Earth. Chapter 1. Journey of an inhabitant of the star Sirius to the planet Saturn. On one of the planets orbiting the star known as Sirius, there lived a very intelligent young man whom I had the honor of meeting during his last journey to our small anthill. His name was Micromegas, a name that suits all those who are large. He stood 8 leagues tall. By 8 leagues, I mean 24,000 geometric feet of 5 feet each. Some algebraists, always helpful to the public, will immediately take up their pens and calculate that since Mr. Micromegas, a resident of the land of Sirius, measures 24,000 steps from head to toe, which makes 120,000 real feet, and we, citizens of Earth, measure only 5 feet, and our globe has a circumference of 9,000 leagues, they will find, I say, that it is absolutely necessary for the globe that produced him to have a circumference precisely 21,600,000 times greater than our little Earth. Nothing is more simple and common in nature. The states of certain sovereigns in Germany or Italy, which can be traversed in half an hour compared to the empires of Turkey, Muscovy, or China, are but a faint reflection of the prodigious differences that nature has placed among all beings. Given the size of His Excellency as I have described, all our sculptors and painters would undoubtedly agree that his waistline could well reach 5,000 real feet, giving him a fine proportion. As for his mind, it is one of the most cultivated one might encounter. He knows many things and has invented a few. By the age of 250, he was already studying, as is customary, at the Jesuit college on his planet, and thanks to the power of his intelligence, he guessed more than 50 propositions of Euclid. This is 18 more than Blaise Pascal, who, after guessing 32 as a game according to his sister, then became a rather mediocre geometer and a disastrous metaphysician. At around 450 years old, emerging from childhood, he dissected several of those tiny insects that do not exceed 100 feet in diameter and escape ordinary microscopes. He composed a very curious book about them, but it brought him some trouble. The Mufti of his country, a great stickler and very ignorant, found in this book some suspect, shocking, reckless, heretical propositions smelling of heresy, and promptly prosecuted him. The question was whether the substantial form of the fleas of Sirius was of the same nature as that of snails. Micromegas defended himself intelligently, rallied women to his cause, and the trial lasted 220 years. Finally, the Mufti had the book condemned by jurists who had not read it, and he was ordered not to show himself at court for 800 years. This prescription affected him only moderately, as the court was filled with embarrassment and pettiness. He composed a very witty song against the Mufti, who paid little attention to it, and set off to travel from planet to planet to perfect his mind and heart, as is often said. Those who only travel by stagecoach or carriage will surely be astonished by the means of transport up there, for here, on our little mound of mud, we can imagine nothing beyond our own usages. Our traveller was well versed in the laws of gravitation and all the attractive and repulsive forces. He used them so skillfully that, with the aid of a ray of sunlight, or thanks to the convenience of a planet, he travelled from globe to globe, he and his companions, like a bird flying from branch to branch. He traversed the Milky Way in a short time. I must confess that he never saw, through the stars that compose it, that beautiful Empyrean sky that the famous Vicar Derham claimed to have seen through his telescope. It is not that I mean to say that Mr. Derham saw it incorrectly, God forbid, but Micromegas was there, and he is a good observer, and I do not wish to contradict anyone. After much travel, Micromegas arrived on the globe of Saturn. As accustomed as he was to seeing new things, he could not help but smile with a hint of superiority at the smallness of the globe and its inhabitants, as even the wisest sometimes do. For Saturn is, after all, only 900 times larger than Earth, and the citizens of this land are dwarfs who measure only about 1,000 fathoms in height. He mocked them at first with his servants, much like an Italian musician arriving in France with the music of Lully. But as the Syrian was understanding, he quickly realized that a thinking being could very well not be ridiculous, even if it measured only 6,000 feet tall. He became familiar with the Saturnians after astonishing them. He befriended the secretary of the Saturn Academy, a very intelligent man who had invented nothing but faithfully reported the inventions of others and composed decent verses and lengthy calculations. To satisfy my readers, I will recount a peculiar conversation that Micromegas had one day with Monsieur the Secretary. Chapter 2. Conversation of the inhabitant of Sirius with that of Saturn. After His Excellency had reclined and the Secretary approached his face, "One must admit," said Micromegas, "that nature is very varied." "Yes," said the Saturnian, "nature is like a flower-bed." "Oh," said the other, "spare me that flower-bed." "It is," continued the Secretary, "like a collection of blondes and brunettes whose adornments—" "But what do I care about brunettes?" said the other. "Then it is like a gallery of paintings whose features—" "Oh no," said the traveller, "I repeat, nature is like nature. Why seek comparisons?" "To please you," replied the Secretary. "I do not wish to be pleased," replied the traveller. "I want to be instructed. Start by telling me how many senses the people of your globe possess." "We have 72, said the academician, "and we complain every day about their smallness. Our imagination exceeds our needs. It seems to us that with our 72 senses, our ring, and our 5 moons, we are too limited. And despite all our curiosity and the quite large number of passions that stem from our 72 senses, we still have time to be bored." "I believe you," said Micromegas, "for on our globe we have nearly 1,000 senses, and we still have some vague desire, some anxiety that constantly reminds us that we are but a little thing, and that there are beings far more perfect. I have travelled a bit. I have seen mortals far inferior to us, and I have seen some far superior, but I have never seen anyone who had more desires than genuine needs, and more needs than satisfactions. Perhaps one day I will arrive in a land where nothing is lacking, but until now, no one has given me any positive news of that land." The Saturnian and the Syrian then exhausted themselves in conjectures, but after many very ingenious and very uncertain arguments, they had to return to the facts. "How long do you live?" said the Syrian. "Very little time," replied the little man from Saturn. "Just like us," said the Syrian, "we always complain about the brevity of life. It must be a universal law of nature." "Unfortunately," said the Saturnian, "we live only 500 revolutions of the sun. This corresponds to about 15,000 years by your way of counting. You see, it is barely dying upon being born. Our existence is a point, our duration an instant, our globe an atom. As soon as one begins to learn a little, death arrives before one has acquired any experience. I dare not make any plans. I feel like a drop of water in an immense ocean. I'm especially ashamed before you of the ridiculous role I play in this world." Micromegas replied, "If you were not a philosopher, I would fear to distress you by informing you that our life is 700 times longer than yours. But you know too well that when the time comes to return one's body to the elements, and to revive nature in another form, what is called dying, whether one has lived an eternity or a day, is exactly the same thing. I visited a country where people live 1,000 times longer than we do, and I found that they still complained, but everywhere there are sensible people who know how to resign themselves and thank the author of nature. He has spread in this universe a great profusion of varieties with a kind of admirable uniformity. For example, all thinking beings are different, but at the same time they all resemble each other in the gift of thought and desire. Matter extends everywhere, but it has in each globe distinct properties. How many different properties do you count in your matter? If you are talking about those properties, said the Saturnian, without which we believe this globe could not subsist as it is, we count 300 such as extent, impermeability, mobility, gravitation, divisibility, and others. Apparently, replied the traveller, this small number suffices for the purposes that the Creator had for your little abode. I admire his wisdom in everything. Everywhere I see differences, but also proportions. Your globe is small, your inhabitants are too. You have few sensations, your matter has few properties. All this is the work of Providence. What colour is your sun when examined closely? A very yellowish white, said the Saturnian, and when we divide one of its rays, we find that it contains 7 colours. Our sun leans toward red, said the Syrian, and we have 39 primary colours. There are no 2 suns that resemble each other among all those I have approached, just as there are no 2 identical faces among us. After several questions of this kind, he inquired about the number of essentially different substances recorded on Saturn. He learned that they counted about 30, such as God, space, matter, beings that have extent and can feel, beings that have extent can feel and think, thinking beings without extent, those that penetrate each other and those that do not penetrate, and others as well. The Syrian, who counted 300 on his planet and had discovered 3,000 during his travels, astonished the philosopher of Saturn. Finally, after sharing a bit of what they knew with each other, and after discussing for one solar revolution, they decided to take a small philosophical journey together. Chapter 3. Journey of 2 inhabitants of Sirius and Saturn. Our 2 philosophers were ready to embark in the atmosphere of Saturn, with an excellent supply of mathematical instruments, when the beloved of the Saturnian, to whom the news had reached, came in tears to scold him. She was a pretty brunette who measured only 660 fathoms, but compensated for her small stature with her many charms. "Alas, cruel one," she exclaimed, "after resisting me for 500 years, while I was beginning to yield, and having spent only 100 years in your arms, you leave me to travel with a giant from another world. Go, you are nothing but a curious being, you have never loved. If you were a true Saturnian, you would be faithful. Where do you want to go? What are you looking for? Our 5 moons are less wandering than you. Our ring is less changeable. It's decided I will never love anyone again." The philosopher kissed her, wept with her, although he was a philosopher, and the lady, after fainting, went to console herself with a local young master. Meanwhile, our 2 curious travellers set off. They first jumped onto the ring, which they found quite flat, as had been well guessed by an illustrious inhabitant of our small globe. From there, they passed from moon to moon. A comet was passing very close to the last one. They jumped onto it with their servants and instruments. After travelling about 500 million leagues, they found the satellites of Jupiter. They passed over Jupiter itself and stayed there for a year, during which they learned some very beautiful secrets that would be printed today, if it weren't for the gentlemen of the Inquisition, who found certain propositions too harsh. But I read the manuscript in the library of the illustrious Archbishop, who generously let me see his books with a kindness that is impossible to praise. But let us return to our travellers. Upon leaving Jupiter, they crossed a space of about 100 million leagues and rounded the planet Mars, which, as is known, is 5 times smaller than our little globe. They saw 2 moons serving this planet that had escaped the gaze of our astronomers. I know well that Father Castell will write, with much verve, against the existence of these 2 moons. But I leave it to those who reason by analogy. These good philosophers know how difficult it would be for Mars, so far from the Sun, to be content with less than 2 moons. In any case, our friends found this so small that they feared they would not find a place to sleep, and continued on their way like 2 travellers who despise a village inn, and continue until the next city. But the Syrian and his companion soon regretted this. They walked a long time without finding anything. Finally, they spotted a small light. It was Earth. This saddened those who had come from Jupiter. However, fearing to regret a second time, they decided to land. They passed by the tail of the comet and found a ready-made aurora borealis. They slipped into it and arrived on Earth by the northern edge of the Baltic Sea on July 5th of the year 1737, according to the new calendar. Chapter 4. What happened to them on Earth? After resting for a while, they had breakfast with 2 mountains, which their servants prepared quite well. Then they wanted to explore the little country where they found themselves. They began by going from north to south. The ordinary steps of the Syrian and his servants measured about 30,000 royal feet. The Saturnian dwarf followed them from afar, panting, as he had to take about 12 steps for each stride of the other. Imagine, if such comparisons are possible, a small dog following a captain of the guards of the King of Prussia. As these foreigners walked quite quickly, they made a circuit of the globe in 36 hours. The sun, or rather the Earth, makes this same journey in a day, but one must think that it is much more pleasant to turn on one's own axis than to walk on one's feet. They had already returned to their starting point after seeing that puddle, almost imperceptible to them, that is called the Mediterranean, and that other small pond, which, under the name of Great Ocean, surrounds the molehill. The water had reached only halfway up the dwarf's leg and barely the heel of the other. They did everything they could, going back and forth to see whether this globe was inhabited or not. They bent down, lay down and felt everywhere, but their eyes and hands were not proportioned to the tiny beings that crawl here. They did not receive the slightest sensation that could lead them to suspect that we, the inhabitants of this globe, have the honor of existing. The dwarf, who sometimes judged a bit too hastily, first concluded that there was no one on Earth. His first reason was that he had seen no one. Micromegas politely pointed out to him that this was rather poor reasoning. Because, he said, you do not see with your little eyes certain 5th magnitude stars that I can distinguish very well. You conclude that they do not exist. But, said the dwarf, I felt well. However, replied the other, you felt poorly. But, said the dwarf, this globe is so poorly constructed, it is so irregular, and its shape seems so ridiculous to me. Everything here seems chaotic. Look at these streams. None goes straight. These ponds are neither round nor square nor oval nor of any regular shape. These little pointed pebbles with which it is bristled and which have hurt my feet. He was speaking of the mountains. Do you notice the shape of the globe as a whole, how it is flattened at the poles, and how clumsily it turns around the sun, so that the lands of the poles are necessarily uninhabited? Frankly, what makes me think there is no one here is that I believe that sensible people would not want to live in this place. Well, said Micromegas, perhaps the people who live here are not entirely sensible, but after all, it does not seem that this has been done in vain. You find that everything here seems irregular, because in Saturn and Jupiter, everything is made with a ruler. Well, perhaps for that very reason, there is a bit of disorder here. Didn't I tell you that in my travels I had always noticed variety? The Saturnian responded to all these reasons. The dispute would have never ended if, by chance, in the fervor of the discussion, Micromegas had not broken the thread of his diamond necklace. The diamonds fell. They were good carats, quite uneven, the largest weighing 400 pounds and the smallest 50. The dwarf picked up a few. He realized by bringing them close to his eyes that these diamonds, by the way they were cut, were excellent microscopes. He then took a small one, 160 feet in diameter, and brought it close to his pupil, and Micromegas chose one 2,500 feet. They were excellent, but at first it did not help them at all. They needed to be adjusted. Finally, the inhabitant of Saturn spotted something imperceptible moving between 2 waters in the Baltic Sea. It was a whale. He skillfully grabbed it with his little finger and, placing it on the nail of his thumb, showed it to the Syrian, who laughed once again at the excessive smallness of the inhabitants of our globe. The Saturnian, convinced that the world was inhabited, immediately imagined that it was populated only by whales, and since he loved reasoning so much, he wanted to guess from where the movement of such a tiny atom came, whether it had ideas, a will, or freedom. This cost Micromegas a lot. He examined the animal with great patience, and the examination concluded that it was impossible to believe that a soul could be lodged there. The 2 travelers thus leaned towards thinking that there was no spirit in our dwelling when, with the help of the microscope, they spotted something the size of a whale floating in the Baltic Sea. It is known that at that precise moment, a band of philosophers was returning from the polar circle, where they had gone to make observations that no one had been aware of until then. The newspapers will say that their ship ran aground on the coasts of Bothnia and that they had much trouble getting to safety, But in this world one never knows the ins and outs of things. I will naively recount what happened, without adding anything personal, which is no small task for a historian. Chapter 5. Experiments and Reasonings of Two Travelers. Micromegas gently extended his hand towards the place where the object appeared, advancing his fingers, withdrawing them for fear of being mistaken, then reopening and grasping them again. He skillfully seized the ship carrying those gentlemen and placed it back on his nail without squeezing too hard for fear of crushing it. "This is a very different creature from the first," said the Saturnian dwarf. The Syrian placed the supposed animal in the palm of his hand. The passengers and crew, who had thought they were being swept away by a hurricane and believed they were on some sort of rock, all began to move. The sailors seized barrels of wine, threw them into Micromegas' hand, and then jumped in after them. The geometers took their graduated segments, their sectors, and a few young Lappish girls, and descended onto the Syrian's fingers. They managed to the point where he finally felt something moving that tickled his fingers. It was the iron tip of a 1-foot-long stick being pressed into his index finger. He judged from this sensation that something had come out of the small animal he held, but at first he suspected nothing more. The microscope, which could barely distinguish between a whale and a boat, was incapable of capturing a being as imperceptible as humans. I do not mean to offend anyone's vanity, but I feel compelled to ask scholars to reflect with me for a moment. Considering the size of men, who measure about 5 feet, we represent on Earth hardly more than what would be represented, on a sphere 10 feet in circumference, by an animal about the 600 millionth part of an inch tall. Imagine a substance capable of holding the Earth in its hand and having organs proportionate to ours. It is entirely possible that there exists a great number of such substances. Then imagine, I pray you, what they would think of the battles that 2 villages sometimes engage in. I have no doubt that if a captain of the King's Grenadiers reads this work one day, he will add at least 2 feet to the hats of his troops, but I warn him that, whatever he does, he and his will always be infinitely small beings. What incredible skill our philosopher from Sirius will need to perceive the atoms I just mentioned. When Leeuwenhoek and Hartsoeker saw, or thought they saw, the first atoms of which we are made, they did not make a discovery nearly as astounding. What joy did Micromegas feel in watching these tiny machines move, examining all their movements, following them in all their operations. What exclamations he made. With what pleasure he placed a microscope in the hands of his traveling companion. "I see them," they both said at the same time. "Don't you see them carrying burdens, bending down, rising up?" As they spoke, their hands trembled with delight at the thought of discovering such new objects, and with fear of losing them. The Saturnian, moving from an excess of suspicion to an excess of gullibility, believed he perceived that they were working towards their propagation. "Ah," he said, "I have caught nature in the act." But appearances deceived him. This happens far too often whether one uses a microscope or not. Chapter 6. What happened to them with humans? Micromegas, much more observant than the dwarf, clearly saw that these atoms were speaking to each other. He pointed this out to his companion, who, ashamed of having been mistaken about generation, did not want to believe that such creatures could communicate with ideas. He had, just like the Syrian, the gift of languages, but he did not understand our atoms and assumed they did not speak. Moreover, how could these imperceptible beings have organs for voice, and what could they have to say to each other? To speak, one must think, or at least something close to it, but if they thought, they would have the equivalent of a soul, and attributing this to such a species seemed absurd to him. "But," said the Syrian, "you believed a moment ago that they were coupling. Do you think it is possible to make love without thinking and without uttering words, or at least without being understood? Would you suppose it is more difficult to produce an argument than a child? To me, both seem to be great mysteries." "I no longer dare to believe or deny," said the dwarf. "I have no opinion left. We should try to examine these insects, and then we can reason." "Well said," replied Micromegas. Immediately he took out a pair of scissors with which he trimmed his nails, and with a fragment of his thumbnail he quickly fashioned a kind of large trumpet, like a wide funnel, the tube of which slipped into his ear. The circumference of the funnel encompassed the ship and all the crew. The faintest voice penetrated through the circular fibers of the nail, so that, thanks to his ingenious device, the philosopher from above perfectly heard the buzzing of our insects down here. In a few hours he managed to distinguish words and finally understand French. The dwarf did the same, albeit with more difficulty. The travelers' astonishment increased moment by moment. They heard moths talking with enough common sense. This game of nature seemed inexplicable to them. You can imagine that the Syrian and the dwarf burned with desire to begin a conversation with the atoms. They feared that their thunderous voices, especially that of Micromegas, would deafen these moths and that they would not be heard. They therefore had to temper the strength of their voices. They placed in their mouths a sort of small toothpicks, the sharp tips of which fell near the ship. The Syrian held the dwarf on his knees and the ship with its crew on one of his nails. He lowered his head and spoke softly. Finally, thanks to all these precautions and many others, he began his speech as follows. Invisible insects, whom the hand of the Creator has deigned to bring forth in the abyss of the infinitely small, I give thanks for allowing me to discover secrets that seemed impenetrable. Perhaps at my court one would not deign to look at you, but I do not despise anyone, and I offer you my protection. This astonished those who heard these words. They could not guess where they came from. The ship's chaplain recited the prayers of the exorcisms, the sailors swore, and the philosophers on the ship developed a theory, but despite all their systems, they could not guess who was speaking to them. Chapter 5. Experiences and Reasonings of Two Travelers. Micromegas gently reached out his hand toward the spot where the object was appearing, extending his fingers, withdrawing them for fear of making a mistake, then reopening and squeezing them. He skillfully grasped the ship carrying these gentlemen and set it down on his nail, being careful not to squeeze too hard for fear of crushing it. This is a very different creature from the first one, said the Saturnian dwarf. The Syrian placed the supposed animal in the palm of his hand. The passengers and crew, who had believed they were being carried away by a hurricane and thought they were on a sort of rock, all began to move. The sailors seized barrels of wine, tossed them into Micromegas' hand, and then jumped in after them. The geometers took their graduated segments, their sectors, and a few young Lapland girls, and descended onto the fingers of the Syrian. They managed so well that he eventually felt something moving that tickled his fingers. It was the iron tip of a 1-foot-long stick that was being poked into his index finger. He judged from this sensation that something had come out of the little animal he was holding, but at first he suspected nothing more. The microscope, which barely allowed one to distinguish between a whale and a boat, did not detect a being as imperceptible as men. I do not mean to offend anyone's vanity, but I find myself compelled to ask the scholars to reflect a little with me. Considering the size of men, who measure about 5 feet, we represent on Earth hardly more than what a creature about the 600 millionth part of an inch tall would represent on a sphere 10 feet in circumference. Imagine a substance capable of holding the Earth in its hand, with organs proportionate to ours, and it is quite possible that there are many such substances. Imagine then, if you please, what they might think of these battles that two villages have sometimes waged against each other. I have no doubt that if a captain of the King's Grenadiers reads this work one day, he will add at least 2 feet to the caps of his troops. But I warn him that, whatever he does, he and his men will always be nothing but infinitely small beings. What incredible skill will our philosopher from Sirius not need to perceive the atoms of which I have just spoken? When Leeuwenhoek and Hartzeker saw, or thought they saw, the first atoms of which we are made, they did not make such a stunning discovery. What joy did Micromegas feel upon seeing these little machines move, examining all their movements, following them in all their operations. What exclamations he let out. With what pleasure he placed a microscope in the hands of his traveling companion. "I see them," they both said at the same time. "Do you not see them carrying loads, bending down, standing up?" As they spoke thus, their hands trembled with pleasure at the thought of discovering such new objects, and with fear of losing them. The Saturnian, swinging from an excess of suspicion to an excess of credulity, believed he perceived that they were working on their propagation. "Ah," he said, "I have caught nature in the act." But appearances deceived him. It happens far too often whether one uses a microscope or not. Chapter 6. What happened to them with men? Micromegas, being much more observant than the dwarf, clearly saw that these atoms were communicating with each other. He pointed this out to his companion, who, ashamed of having been mistaken about generation, would not believe that such creatures could communicate with ideas. He had, just like the Syrian, the gift of tongues, but he did not understand our atoms and supposed they did not speak. Moreover, how could these imperceptible beings have organs for voice, and what would they have to say to one another? To speak, one must think, or at least something close to it. But if they thought, they would have the equivalent of a soul, and attributing this to such a species seemed absurd to him. "But," said the Syrian, "you just believed a moment ago that they were mating. Do you think it possible to make love without thinking and without uttering words, or at least without being understood? Would you suppose it more difficult to produce an argument than a child? To me, both seem great mysteries." "I no longer dare to believe or deny," said the dwarf. "I have no opinion left. We must try to examine these insects. Then we will reason." "Well said," replied Micromegas. Immediately he took out a pair of scissors with which he cut his nails, and with a fragment of the nail from his thumb, he immediately fashioned a sort of large trumpet, like a wide funnel whose tube slid into his ear. The circumference of the funnel enveloped the ship and all the crew. The slightest voice penetrated through the circular fibers of the nail, so that, thanks to his ingenious device, the philosopher from above perfectly heard the buzzing of our insects down here. In a few hours, he managed to distinguish the words and finally understand French. The dwarf did the same, though with more difficulty. The astonishment of the travellers grew moment by moment. They heard moths speaking with quite a bit of common sense. This play of nature seemed inexplicable to them. You can well imagine that the Syrian and the dwarf were burning with desire to start a conversation with the atoms. They feared that their thunderous voices, especially that of Micromegas, would deafen these moths, and that they would not hear them. They therefore had to soften their strength. They placed in their mouths a sort of small toothpick, the sharp tip of which fell near the ship. The Syrian held the dwarf on his knees and the ship with the crew on one of his nails. He bowed his head and spoke softly. Finally, thanks to all these precautions and many others, he began his speech like this: "Invisible insects whom the hand of the Creator has deigned to bring forth in the abyss of the infinitely small, I give thanks for allowing me to discover secrets that seemed impenetrable. Perhaps at my court they will not deign to look at you, but I do not despise anyone, and I offer you my protection." This astonished those who heard these words. They could not guess whence they came. The ship's chaplain recited the exorcism prayers, the sailors swore, and the ship's philosophers devised a theory. But despite all their systems, they could not guess who was speaking to them. Chapter 7. Conversation with Men. The Saturnian dwarf, who had a voice softer than Micromegas's, then explained to them in a few words to what species they were dealing with. He told them of the journey from Saturn, revealed to them who Monsieur Micromegas was, and after pitying them for being so small, he asked them if they had always been in this miserable state so close to nothingness, what they were doing on a globe that seemed to belong to whales, whether they were happy, whether they multiplied, whether they had a soul, and 100 other questions of this sort. A reasoner from the group, bolder than the others, and offended that anyone would doubt the existence of his soul, observed the speaker with pointed pins on a graduated segment, took 2 measurements, and at the third said this: "You believe, sir, that because you measure 1,000 fathoms from head to foot, you are a—" "1,000 fathoms!" exclaimed the dwarf. "Heavens, how can he know my size? 1,000 fathoms! He is not mistaken by an inch. How is this possible? This atom has measured me. He is a geometer. He knows my size, and I can only see him with the help of a microscope, and I still do not know his." "Yes, I have measured you," said the physicist, "and I would measure your companion as well." The proposal was accepted. His Excellency lay down on the ground, for if he had stood, his head would have been well above the clouds. Our philosophers planted a large tree at a place that Dr. Swift would name, but which I will refrain from mentioning out of respect for the ladies. Then, with a series of interconnected triangles, they concluded that what they saw was indeed a young man of 120,000 royal feet. Micromegas then pronounced these words: "I now see more than ever that one should not judge by apparent size. O God, you who have given intelligence to substances that seem so contemptible, you master as well the infinitely small as the infinitely great, and if it is possible that there exist beings smaller than these, they may still have a mind superior to that of those proud animals I have seen in the sky, of which a single foot would cover the entire globe on which we landed." One of the philosophers replied to him that he could be sure of the existence of intelligent beings much smaller than man. He told him not everything that Virgil has said fabulously about bees, but rather what Swammerdam had discovered, and what Romur had dissected. He finally showed him that there are animals that are to bees what bees are to man, what the Syrian himself is to those animals as vast as they were said to be, and what those large animals are to other substances, before which they appear to be mere atoms. Gradually the conversation became interesting, and Micromegas spoke thus: "O intelligent atoms in whom the eternal being has delighted to manifest his skill and power, surely you must experience pure joys on your globe, for having so little matter and seeming all spirit, you must spend your life loving and thinking. That is the true life of spirits. Nowhere have I seen true happiness, but here it is without a doubt." At these words, all the philosophers shook their heads, and one of them, more frank than the others, honestly admitted that with the exception of a small number of inhabitants to whom little attention was paid, all the others were a group of fools, wicked and unhappy. "We have more matter than we need," he said, "to do a lot of harm if harm comes from matter, and too much spirit if harm comes from spirit. Do you know, for example, that at this moment, while I speak to you, there are 100,000 fools of our kind, wearing hats, who kill 100,000 others wearing turbans or who are killed by them, and that this has been going on in almost every corner of the earth since time immemorial?" The Syrian shuddered and asked what could be the reason for these horrible disputes among such weak animals. "It is a matter," said the philosopher, "of a few heaps of mud the size of your heel. It is not that one of those millions of men who get their throats cut claims to obtain a blade of straw from that heap of mud. It is simply a question of whether it will belong to a certain man called Sultan, or to another called, for I do not know why, Caesar. Neither of them has ever seen, nor will they ever see, the piece of land in question, and almost none of those animals, who mutually slaughter each other, have seen the animal for whom they are killing themselves." "Alas, miserable ones!" exclaimed the Syrian with indignation. "Is it possible to conceive such an excess of furious folly? I feel like taking 3 steps and crushing this nest of ridiculous murderers." "Do not bother," they replied. "They are already working sufficiently at their own ruin. Know that in 10 years, not even 1/100th of these wretches will remain, and know that even if they had not drawn their swords, hunger, fatigue, or intemperance will take away almost all of them. Moreover, it is not these people who should be punished, but rather these avaricious barbarians, who, from the depths of their cabinets, order during their digestion the murder of 1,000,000 men, and then command that thanks be given solemnly to God for it." The traveller was moved by pity for the smallness of the human race, in which he discovered such astonishing contrasts. "Since you are part of the small number of wise ones," he said to these gentlemen, "and that apparently you do not kill anyone for money, tell me, I beg you, what you are dedicated to." "We dissect flies," said the philosopher. "We measure lines. We add numbers. We agree on 2 or 3 points that we understand, and we dispute over 2 or 3,000 that we do not understand." Immediately the Syrian and the Saturnian felt the desire to interrogate these thinking atoms to know on what things they agreed. "How many degrees do you count from the dog star to the great star of Gemini?" All replied at the same time, 32 degrees and a half. "How many do you count from here to the moon?" 60 half diameters of the earth, rounding the figures. "How much does your air weigh?" He thought he would trap them, but they all told him that air weighs about 900 times less than its own volume of the lightest water, and 1900 times less than gold of the ducat. The little dwarf from Saturn, astonished by their answers, was tempted to take for sorcerers these same people to whom, a quarter of an hour earlier, he had denied a soul. Finally, Micromegas said to them, "Since you know so well what is outside of you, you must surely know even better what is within yourselves. Tell me what your soul is and how you form your ideas." The philosophers all spoke at the same time as before, but they had different opinions. The eldest cited Aristotle, another pronounced the name of Descartes, this one that of Malebranche, another that of Leibniz, and that one the name of Locke. An old peripatetic said loudly and confidently, "The soul is an entelechy, and a reason why what is has the power to be." This is what Aristotle explicitly states, page 633 of the Louvre edition. "I do not understand Greek very well," said the giant. "Neither do I," said the philosophical mite. "Then," replied the Syrian, "why do you cite a certain Aristotle in Greek?" "It is because," answered the sage, "it is necessary to cite what one does not understand at all in the language that one understands the least." The Cartesian spoke up and said, "The soul is a pure spirit that received in its mother's womb all metaphysical ideas, and that, upon leaving, is obliged to go to school and relearn all that it knew so well, and which it will never know again." "Then there was not much interest," replied the 8-league animal, "in your soul being so knowledgeable in your mother's womb, to be so ignorant when you have a beard on your chin." "But what do you mean by spirit?" "But what are you asking me?" said the reasoner. "I have no idea. It is said that it is not matter." "But do you at least know what matter is?" "Very well," replied the man. "For example, this stone is grey and of such a shape it has 3 dimensions. It is heavy and divisible." "Well," said the Syrian, "would you finally tell me what this thing is that seems divisible, heavy, and grey to you? You see some attributes, but do you know the essence of the thing?" "No," said the other. "Then you do not know what matter is." Then Mr. Micromegas, addressing another sage he held on his thumb, asked him what his soul was and what it did. "Absolutely nothing," replied the malbranchist philosopher. "God does everything for me. I see everything in him. I do everything in him. He does everything without my intervention." "Better not to exist," replied the wise man from Sirius. "And you, my friend," he said to a Leibnizian who was there, "what is your soul?" "It is," replied the Leibnizian, "a needle that marks the hours while my body rings the bell, or if you prefer, it is she who rings while my body marks the hour, or else my soul is the mirror of the universe and my body the edge of the mirror. It is clear." A small supporter of Locke was nearby, and when they finally addressed him, "I don't know," he said, "how I think, but I know that I have only thought while being moved by my senses. That immaterial and intelligent substances exist, I have no doubt, but that God cannot communicate thought to matter, that is what I seriously doubt. I revere the eternal power. It is not for me to limit it. I affirm nothing. I merely believe that there are more possible things than one thinks." The Sirius animal smiled. He did not find this one the least wise, and the Saturnian dwarf would have embraced Locke's follower if it hadn't been for that extreme disproportion. But alas, there was a small animal wearing a square cap who spoke in place of all the little philosophical animals. He said he knew all the secret, that it was found in the Summa of St. Thomas. He looked down from above at the 2 celestial inhabitants. He claimed that their persons, their worlds, their suns, their stars, everything had been made solely for man. At these words, our 2 travelers fell upon each other, choking with that unquenchable laughter that is, according to Homer, the attribute of the gods. Their shoulders and bellies heaved and rolled, and in these convulsions, the ship, which the Syrian held on his nail, fell into the pocket of the Saturnian's pants. These 2 good people searched for it for a long time. Finally, they found the luggage and carefully put it back in place. The Syrian took the little moths and spoke to them again with much kindness, although deep in his heart he was a bit irritated to see that the infinitely small had an almost infinitely great pride. He promised them he would write them a beautiful book of philosophy, written in very small print for their use, and in this book they would see the essence of things. Indeed, he gave them this volume before departing. He took it to Paris to the Academy of Sciences, but when the secretary opened it, he saw only a completely blank book. "Alas," he said, "I expected as much.